You know, the German philosopher Kant once made the observation that three main concerns of any kind of philosophical inquiry. One is how do we know? That question is linked to the whole question of what the philosophers will call epistemology. That is how we'll be able to acquire knowledge. And the second question is what must we do? That leads to the whole question of morality and ethics. And the third question is what can we hope? Which from Kant's point of view relates to the question of theology, of religion, of hope. So he considers these three domains: how to acquire knowledge, how to behave properly, and how do we hope, are comprehensive of the philosophical domain. But from the Confucian point of view, there's another question which may be even more fundamental. That is the question of who am I? What is the meaning of being human? If we do not know this particular question, what is the meaning of being human, then all the other questions may be intellectually extremely stimulating. They will not necessarily address the essential philosophical question as the quest for wisdom or the quest for truth. So, in fact, quite a number of Western philosophers also come to the conclusion that we should understand what now they call philosophical anthropology. You know, what is the idea of being human? Now, if you look at the dates, Zhu Xi, we jumped for more than 1,000 years, probably 1800. So we're now moving just 2 lectures on the so-called Neo-Confucian mode of thinking before we get to the contemporary issues. One on Zhu Xi, the other one on Weiming. And you should be able to get a general account of Zhu Xi's biography, his time, the major issues concerned, with the reading from Dan Gardner, How to Be a Sage, translations of works from Zhu Xi. So I'm not going to repeat any of those ideas there. But simply to know that Zhu Xi, more than 1,000, certainly 1,000 years after the classical period that we've been studying, of the period of Mencius, of the great learning of the doctrine of the Ming, certainly of Xunzi, and the Confucian Analects, the Wei seems to have somewhat disappeared, and it's his responsibility, first of all, try to retrieve the tradition. So it's an act of retrieving, to reanimate the old, try to represent the tradition. And he made it very clear in terms of his choice that the Confucian tradition is about the way, capital W-A-Y, the Tao, about the way. It is not simply a tradition to managing the world in terms of practical affairs, even though the Confucians are all deeply involved in administrative work. You know, Zhu Xi himself was an administrator, was a magistrate, and all of them were very much involved in the world, unlike many other spiritual traditions which created a kind of spiritual sanctuary outside of the world we live in. The Confucians were involved in the world. That's taken for granted. But Zhu Xi said, no, that's not our business simply to manage in the world, even though it is our responsibility. But that's not our way in the ultimate sense. Nor is the Confucian tradition a scholarly tradition, with the study of the classics, study of the literature, study of history, study of all the great writings of the ancient sages. It is a scholarly tradition. It's very important to understand the classics, to understand texts, to try to study them. But that's not necessarily essential. The essential way, from Zhu Xi's point of view, is personal self-realization. Now, personal self-realization is linked to managing the world on the one hand, and to be involved in scholarly inquiry. But the sense of priority is very clear. So to reappropriate, first to retrieve the tradition, is to retrieve the meaning of Confucianism as a philosophy or as an idea of self-realization. It's personal self-realization. If you're not personally involved in terms of your total person, then the tradition is marginalized. But he was also involved not only in the retrieval of the tradition, but also reappropriation. Reappropriation meaning he tried hard as a scholar, as also a man trying to manage the world, but now focusing on self-realization, how to reappropriate the wisdom of the tradition. He came to the realization that the 4 books, more so than the 5 classics, could serve as the basis for the Confucian core curriculum. Therefore, he made it very explicit that the Confucian learning should begin with the Great Learning, which will give you a comprehensive view of how the person is related to society, to the world, and beyond, and how the cultivation of the person involves not only the rectification of the heart and mind, sincerity of the will, but also extension of knowledge and the investigation of things. Then, from the Great Learning, you move on to reading the Analects to get all kinds of different examples of how the master actually dealt with concrete situations in order to come up with a coherent view of learning to be human. And then you study the Book of Mencius to get the whole idea of the human nature right. And finally, you study the doctrine of the mean to come up with a comprehensive view, especially the view, a kind of a world view, which will inform not only your own project of self-realization, but also ethics is not simply about how to be a moral person in the world here and now. It also relates to a much larger project. And so in so doing, Zhu Xi was also involved in reconstruction of the tradition. He did a lot of editorial work. He single-handedly reconstructed the tradition. But that reconstruction is based upon the interplay between identity and adaptation. You first try to find the proper identity of the tradition, the core identity of the tradition, and you try to adapt it to new situations. So he would consider himself very much of a transmitter, not necessarily a creator, but a transmitter. But a transmitter sometimes is more difficult, the role of a transmitter is more difficult to perform than simply a maker. You don't create something out of nothing. You based upon the resources of the tradition, try to retrieve the meaning of it, try to reappropriate, and based upon that retrieval and reappropriation, you do the reconstruction. Now, the reconstruction is based upon Zhu Xi's view of a new kind of philosophical anthropology, a new vision of the human, by introducing some new categories, basically 2 new categories. And I think if I'm successful, you should very easily notice that this whole argument is very much in the tradition of Mencius, in the tradition of Confucius and the Great Learning and the doctrine of the mean, even though it was done more than 18 centuries later. He decided, in terms of his philosophical anthropology, to first reintroduce the idea of the vital energy, of qi. We're familiar with that. Based upon a sense of a continuity of all modalities of being and an evolutionary perspective, qi can be rendered as matter energy. One scholar tried to translate it as material force, but since we have to recognize its original meaning connected with breath and blood, sometimes it's rendered as vital force. I prefer vital energy. And this notion of the vital energy, strictly speaking, is not simply the building block of reality, the building block of everything. You know, the language of particles or nuclei or electrons and so forth seems too materialistic to convey the sense of unspecified power and indeterminate dynamism the word qi actually specifies. So many scholars in Chinese studies now prefer to use transliteration, simply call it qi, just like the Sanskrit terms like karma, like dharma, these terms. You bear in mind, qi is a kind of vital energy or vital force. The emphasis is on the life process. Qi is a kind of a existence in process. You have always tried to think about qi in terms of dynamic transformation. It is not a being, but it's a process of becoming, and every being, a table, a chair, the outside world, everything is made of qi. Therefore, you have to imagine everything as a constellation of some kind of dynamic process. The cosmic vision that underlies this conception of qi is the term great transformation. The whole universe is understood not as a static structure, but as a great transformation, which encompasses all modalities of being in your universe. So nothing, air, water, earth, rock, plant, animal, or human, that is not imbued with qi. Everything is a vital and dynamic constitutive partner of this great transformation. Recently, in the Earth Charter, people try to develop ecological thinking. Earth Charter is a major debate in the early part of the Earth Charter is whether the scientists would be willing to accept the view that many people in indigenous traditions and others just take it for granted that Earth is alive. Can we say the Earth is alive? The Earth is not simply a matter, dead matter out there, but it's alive. It's a major debate. Finally, the Earth Charter, over the period of about 5 or 6 years, agreed, including all the scientists, that we can talk about Earth as alive. So Earth is made of qi. It's a kind of vital energy. Nature is the result of the fusion and intermingling of the vital forces that assumes tangible forms. So mountains, rivers, rocks, trees, animals, and humans are all modalities of this energy matter, symbolizing that the creative transformation of the way is forever present. You may simply now take it as a kind of mysterious idea, but it has some very practical implications. For example, our bodies, I noted this before, could be considered as the human forms of the vital energy of the great transformation that we assume at birth. So our body should be conceived as energy fields rather than simply static structures, not just made of organs, muscles, tissues, and so forth, but energy fields. So it could be understood as communication centers or power stations. And how to process the energy fields becomes critical. Now, let's just end with this brief discussion on qi and introduce another concept. Now, please do not confuse this idea of Li with an earlier Li that we studied quite comprehensively. The same pronunciation, unfortunately, of course, written with different characters. This Li we're talking about is translated as principle and pattern. The other Li is understood as ritual, propriety, or ritual propriety. Let me just give you a graphic sense, then I don't want to confuse you. That Li in classical Chinese is written like this. In simplified Chinese, it's written like this. That's the Li that we're familiar with, as ritual, as propriety. And this Li is written like this. So they're different. Maybe we should say Li 1, Li 2, right? The Li 2, the pattern or the orderliness, means that even though everything is made of this vital energy in transformation, but there is a pattern. There's a principle that underlies the whole process. Especially the notion about the heavenly principle. The heavenly principle is the idea that even though the great transformation is in flux, it's continuously unfolding. There are unspecified power and indeterminate energy. And yet there's orderliness. Deep down, there's orderliness. And there is order without an ordainer. In a sense, there's no creator that shaped the world as it is. It's evolutionary perspective, so to speak. And yet there is a pattern. And there's underlying structure. And therefore, by implication, there's also possibility of a purpose. Our nature, human nature, this particular way in which vital energy crystallizes, endowed us with the ability, particularly from the Confucian point of view, to feel the presence of an ever-expanding network of relationships. Since there's no limit to our sensitivity, there's a privilege in the idea of human sensitivity. The network is always an open system. It is inconceivable that there's something out there that human sensitivity is incapable of communicating with. In fact, the nature of human sensitivity is such that it encompasses or embraces comprehensively to the extent that there's nothing that is not incommunicable. But the ability of the human sensitivity to be all-inclusive is rooted in the common human perceptions or human sensory perceptions, such as seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching. And the body, the human body, so conceived, is of course not just a physiological entity. It is a power station or communication center. But as a power station, it is an energy field rather than simply a collection of discrete organs. As a communication center, it is the convergence of dynamic processes rather than the combination of static structures. And the human dynamic transformation interacts with the outside world, and our sensitivities or our sensory perceptions linked us with the outside world continuously. Now, this notion of humanity, notion of being human, particularly honors sympathy, or by implication, empathy, as the defining characteristic of the human manifestation of the vital energy. You know, I don't want to get into some of the other arguments. Many scholars believe that the human beings received some of the very subtle and delicate vital energies. So our body is made in such a way that we are vulnerable. On the one hand, we're vulnerable. On the other hand, we are sensitive. And our sensitivity becomes a defining characteristic of who we are. And it is in this sense that the human heart and mind, is really the arena in which, now I use heart and mind because these two terms, heart and mind, in Chinese are always rendered just as one word, as the xin, which is written almost like the diagram or the graphic of the heart. But it's not just cognitive capacity. There's also the affective dimension. The assumption is that it is not possible for us to will, to know, to sense without feeling. And the whole Cartesian, as many of you know, Descartes, saying that the true self is the thinking self. We can doubt everything, but we cannot doubt our thinking. And the thinking is the mind. The body is extension. The body is not the defining characteristic of who we are, but the thinking capacity is the mind. This separation of the body and mind, not to mention the mind and heart, are not at all accepted in the Confucian tradition. You can say the Confucian tradition may be a little bit messy. The body and mind are interacting, and the heart and mind are identical, in the sense that when we think, when we feel, or when we think, when we will, when we do anything, our feeling is implied. So the affective, the feeling part, the affective aspect of the heart and mind is just as important as the cognitive. Zhu Xi considers this as the site of contestation, as the battleground. That is how we try to discipline, to manage, to purify, to cultivate our heart and mind. That's the process of learning to be human. Now, let me give you one background. This is my reading. It's not something derived from my primary, the primary sources, my reading. Implicit in this notion of the human, of course, we know that from the doctrine of the mean, human beings are partners of the great transformation. You can say rocks and trees and animals, they're all partners. But human beings are partners in a particular sense. In the Analects, there's a statement that the humans can make the way great, not that the way will make human great. If you don't read it correctly, it's blasphemous, like expansion of the human power, as if you can transform the cosmos. But the idea is not that. The idea is a sense of awe and a sense of responsibility. We humans are endowed with this sensitivity of the heart in such a manner that we are in fact partners of the great transformation. What does it mean by partners? I think there are three meanings, possible meanings. Again, my reading, all right? One is purely aesthetic. The aesthetic sense, sense of beauty, the aesthetic sense is that through a very, very long evolutionary process, human beings emerged as part of that process. And that process of the great transformation, the mountains and rivers and scenery and everything, implicit in the heavens unfolding. Heaven is not necessarily the creator out there creating something out of nothing, but it's part of that transformative process. Out of that transformative process, there is, I don't know whether we want to use the word desire or not, there is the heavenly heart. Zhu Xi talks about the heavenly heart that would like to have that magnificent creativity of the mountains, rivers being appreciated. They need appreciation, need an appreciator to see what's been there, or to hear, to touch, to taste. So the humans came into being because this natural process of creativity is so incredibly magnificent that some kind of reflective power ought to be there to appreciate it. So that's why we're here, as appreciator of this process. Otherwise, there's a statement, if there are no great human beings with reflected power, then 10,000 years would be like a dark night, totally meaningless, just every day. And with the emergence of this sense of the human, try to understand their position in the cosmos, and there's light, there's meaning. Now, many scholars, including some of the great sinologists, consider this as a major flaw in Confucian thinking. The inability to make a distinction between a value and fact. We normally, in ethical thinking, we say we make a clear distinction between what is value, what is fact. These Confucians, looking at the fact of evolution, and confuse that with their own value of the human as an aesthetic being in reflecting upon the creative process. It's a major default. But later, some of the scholars changed their mind. And this, not inability, but this deliberate choice not to make a sharp distinction between fact and value turned out to be very significant. What actually happened evolutionary, we say these are facts, but we learn a great deal from these facts. That's how human beings come into being, through this creative process. So the value is rooted in the, this is like the natural law idea, that value is rooted in the objective creative process of heaven and earth. So the first sense is aesthetic. But there's also an ethical sense. The ethical sense is that human beings, because of sensitivity, should actually become the stewardship, should play the role of a stewardship for this process. Because human beings care, concern, and they have the capacity of feeling the suffering of others. This is deeply in Mencius. That's how Mencius defines what humanity really means. Humanity means one's ability to feel the suffering of others. Therefore, the humans can become, right now, of course, in biblical studies, in Christian studies, there's a lot of debate about whether the humans are created by God to have dominion over the universe. Dominion in the sense of control. Or that dominion actually means stewardship, protector. There's a major debate going on in Christian theology. But in the Confucian tradition, the idea of a partnership is linked to this notion about stewardship. That's the reason why Zhu Xi and others take the doctrine of the mean absolutely seriously when it states that through self-realization, through the realization of our nature, we'll be able to realize the nature of other human beings, the nature of things, and if we can do that, we can take part in the transforming and nourishing processes of heaven and earth. And if we can take part in the transforming and nourishing processes of heaven and earth, we can form a trinity with heaven and earth. So heaven, human, earth form this particular trinity. And therefore, the religious meaning, the ultimate concern of the human, is the realization of the human always has a much larger purpose than simply the realization of a person as an isolated individual. Because this participation in a much larger context. That's the reason why we can understand, I think quite easily, the four major distinctions that Zhu Xi and other Neo-Confucians want to make. The first distinction is between the heavenly principle and the human desire. It's easy to understand human desires. All these, the desire for fame, for position, for success, not simply sex and food and basic instinctual demands. All these human desires are legitimate in the Confucian tradition because the tradition is not interested in asceticism, in the idea of getting rid of all the desire so we become free. That's not the project of the tradition. All these desires are legitimate, but they have to be transformed by a much larger human concern. If they are not transformed, they just simply become not just means to an end, but become ends themselves. They are restrictive. What is the end? The end is exactly what I talked about. The human is much larger. It should be part of a cosmic process, not simply to search for fame, position, success, simply for the sake of personal gratification. The question was raised, if you read the text, constantly, very much like our situation today. All of Zhu Xi's young friends were involving examinations. They want to pass the examination so they could become successful candidates, and the successful candidates eventually will be appointed to official positions. If you're not successful in the examination, you'll never be able to manage the world, to develop your scholarship, or to lead a decent life that you consider you deserve. So everybody was just overwhelmed by examination again and again. So Zhu Xi says, no, there's no problem about your division of labor. You spend a lot of time preparing yourself for examination. So the actual allocation of time and energy is not the issue. The issue is your ultimate concern. The issue is your will. If your will is never lost, you always see yourself connected in a much broader context. Even if you are totally overwhelmed with work, with the kind of thing you have to do in order to survive, there's a transformative power is always there, and it would do the good job for you. There's one statement, if you have to spend, say, 10 or 15 days a month in order to prepare for the examination, don't forget there are another 15 days. You can do something else. But even if you have to spend 30 days simply doing that, your will to consider all you do not in the context of the kind of inertia, the context in which you have to do it, but in a much broader context of human realization, then there's still the possibility of finding the true self rather than totally overwhelmed by selfishness, by the privatized, therefore closed, and the shallow idea of subjectivism. Rather, you have to understand your true self. And the true self is always communicative, is always open, is always transformative. There's always depth. And your true self is your subjectivity. And there's a clear distinction made between subjectivism, which is linked to a privatized ego, the small self, or in Mencius, the small body, and the true self, which is the great body because it can link itself in a much larger context, especially with the cosmic process. Impartiality also, as opposed to partiality, is also understood in this particular context. And Zhu Xi is quite specific, following the great learning. If you have a sense of direction, now if you still don't have a sense of direction, that's a major problem. If you have a sense of direction, then you will be able to cultivate the calmness of your heart and mind. You can be calm. If you don't have a sense of direction, you'll be restless. If you're restless, your life will be fragmented. If you have a sense of direction, then you can calm your heart and mind, and if you can calm your heart and mind, you can see the linkages. Normally you do not see. If you have the calmness of the mind or tranquility of the mind, then you have a sense of home. The idea is that you should always feel at home anywhere you go, because the sense of feeling at home is an internal quality of your sense of direction and your sense of purpose. And only when you feel at home, you'll be able to cogitate, meaning to think deeply. The kind of thinking is not simply to reflect about something else. The kind of thinking is to quest for self-knowledge, to understand where you are and how you're linked to all kinds of relationships. And only then will you be able to get it. And that term, to get it, in the Chinese, actually it's the functional equivalent of the idea of virtue. Virtue is something that you personally have forgotten it. And that can, in fact, it's a transformative power. You have that virtue, the virtue of courage or virtue of sympathy. These virtues, if you really got them, they radiate outward and transform the quality of your life. And therefore, try always to be impartial. Even though we're just overwhelmed by partiality, by self-centeredness. And we do not go out of this world, do not abandon our active involvement in the world in order to cultivate ourselves. We have to do it in the midst of it. And therefore, the two kinds of knowledge, the moral knowledge on the one hand, and sensory perceptions, the knowledge that I acquire from hearing and seeing, are interrelated. But the sense of priority is clear. We always allow the moral knowledge of the heart and mind, its sensitivity to the outside world, to guide us. Even though sometimes we're overwhelmed by all kinds of other perceptions, sensory perceptions. Moral knowledge and the sensory perception are inseparable. We cannot say now we want to cultivate ourselves, so all these desires for fame, for reputation, for position, and all this work with a very clear instrumental goal to accomplish all these things will have to be totally eliminated. You can't. You're part of the world. So they are not separable. But even though they're not separable, they should not be mixed. Do not mix your desire for fame, for power, for influence with your inner self, which is always in connection with a much larger world. Do not totally mix it. Once you mixed it, it can become, I would say, demonic. That your quest for fame, you think it is for the good of the society, for the good of humanity. Your quest for your own success becomes certain kind of obsession for your mission in life. Once the two are mixed, then you're in trouble. You don't mix them. You know they're connected. And you know what the priority is. And you have to make a distinction between the great and the small. Allow the great to integrate the small, not allow the small to overcome the great. So you're always in this kind of balancing act. Now Zhu Xi, in a way, is somewhat pessimistic. Pessimistic because he felt that learning is hard. Learning to be human is painfully hard. To be fully human is extremely difficult. Following his cosmology, learning to be human involves the investigation of things. The investigation of things is try to probe the principle, the inner pattern in everything. For Zhu Xi, a thing, the English word is quite useful here. You say, do your own thing, or an object as a thing. So a thing is very, very general. An object, an event, an experience, an encounter, any kind of movement, everything could be considered as a thing. You read a text, it's a thing. You try to understand history, it's a thing. You try to make friends, it's a thing. You try to study physics, study chemistry, everything is a thing. Okay. Now, everything, internal to everything, there is a pattern, there's a principle. And your task is to see the coherence, not to develop a general theory, to see the coherence. Because what you need to do is how to lead a meaningful life. You see the coherence of all the things you've been doing. Try to probe the pattern or the inner principle in all the things. You have to take courses in physics and then chemistry. You have to eat, you have to talk to your friends, you have to interact with your family, all these things. And don't just accept all the superficial manifestation of these things as the necessary way of life. Try to probe the patterns, the inner patterns, and see how they are related. And this, of course, painfully difficult. Zhu Xi believes the more you encounter things conscientiously, the more try to search for the pattern inside of thing and see the connectedness of two seemingly unrelated things and broaden them, the more you'll be able to cultivate your mind. And he then believes you have to develop an attitude of reverence, an attitude, what Gardner translates as inner mental attentiveness. It's one word in Chinese, 敬, which means reverence. Some people say seriousness. Your spirit has to be collected. When, no matter what you do, when you do something, when the spirit is collected, then you'll be able to not only do it well, you'll be able to see things that normally, if you do it in a hurry, if you do it half-heartedly, you will never be able to see it. So Zhu Xi's recommendation is that the people who are talented, who are smart, who are intelligent, ought to try to do the most routine, and ought to do the most routine things in the most conscientious way. Precisely because we are smart, we'll be able to do things very well, we'll be able to move from one position to the other. It is necessary that we do our routine job, like getting up, like dressing, like talking, all these things in the most conscientious way. So to allow the smartest people to do the most routine thing is a form of reverence, is a form of self-cultivation. So Zhu Xi would consider my talk, for example, early part of the talk, totally ridiculous. Why? He would say, don't make anything that is not lofty as lofty. Don't make anything that is very near at hand distant. Don't make anything that is shallow, superficial, deep. He doesn't like depth, distance, loftiness. Of course, he is involved in that kind of intellectual enterprise, but he doesn't like that precisely because the discipline that it involves is a totally routinized discipline. He would rather simply to reflect on things near at hand, to do things that are on the surface extremely superficial, to write a paper and improve it, change it 10 or 20 times and still continue to do that. To do things that you know you can master it and you still want to do it. You know, remember the example of Rubinstein as the great pianist, and try to learn the basics at the age of 30 or age 40 and without losing any sense of any note that is significant. The best example for this kind of exercise between the probing of the principle inherent in things with the attitude of reverence is the art of reading. The art of reading for Zhu Xi is one of the most challenging exercises to discover a new meaning. And in the modern sort of phenomenology of reading, it is to overcome one's private self and allow overcome one's private ego and allow the true self to be informed by ever-extending horizon of meaning. So you read a text, for example, a classical text, is not to read the text would transform your sense of yourself or your prejudices, and how you read the text without enforcing your prejudices, but allowing the prejudices to be transformed by the wisdom of the text. You have to be receptacle. You have to be receptive. You have to be non-judgmental. You have to cherish the encounter with the text as meeting an old friend. You establish a dialogical relationship. Of course, you have to control the technical competence. You have to know the words, you have to know sentences, the paraphrase, and so forth. But not only you want to know what it is said, but what it does mean. What does it mean? But in what sense that what it said and what it means also falls short of what you think it should mean, and what it could mean, what it must mean in a particular context. And of course, you struggle with these ideas, these questions, and wrestling with the text. And in terms of your own life, reading the text is, of course, a challenge. It's your own life, then the importance of always being centered and the seek for harmony. One example maybe suffice. If you can do this exercise. If your mind is not centered, you just stand and ask a friend of yours to push you, and you will be off balance right away. But if your mind is centered, for example, without tense up your muscles, anything, simply to focus your attention on the 2 inches below your navel. This is the center, the dantian, the so-called center. You just focus your attention on the navel. And then when the person pushes you, you're not going to move. It's very interesting. You can do that exercise. You let your mind wander around, someone push you, you're off guard right away. If you're just focused, without tense up, you're just focused on this part, you're not moving. And this actually involves, from Zhu Xi's point of view, some very interesting technique. One technique, I probably just have the time to do that now, is the deep breathing. How you breathe normally is important. Of course, quiet sitting and Chen Yi, Zhu Xi's great hero, says the best day for anyone is to spend half a day reading and half a day quiet sitting. I don't know how boring that is, but half a day reading, half a day quiet sitting. They consider that incredibly euphoria. And collect your ideas. And deep breathing, meaning you never breathe simply with your lung. You always breathe much deeper. And when you breathe deeply, that's the proper breathing with your abdomen. You breathe very deeply, then the calmness of the heart will be assured. There's a calmness of the heart. If you learn that kind of breathing anywhere, it will calm your heart, and your heart rate may even slower, and especially in tense situations. And it's the deep breathing and sitting is to go back to a harmonious state of who you are. And that returning to the harmonious state of who you are turned out to be the most critical for the calming of the heart and mind. So Zhu Xi then suggests a way of life in ordinary human existence which is linked to a cosmic order. The cosmos proceeds vigorously. The creativity of the cosmos is unlimited. So the human, taking that as a lead, will have to be ceaseless in our own self-cultivation or our own self-strengthening. Yet there's some challenging questions. I don't have time to go over all these questions, but I simply want to know the 4 challenging questions. Simply note them. The first challenging question is, from this Zhu Xi's project of trying to probe the principle inherent in things and try to be centered and to breathe and to engage in quiet sitting regularly in the spirit of reverence. What are the problems? The first problem is that, can the investigation of things necessarily lead to the sincerity of the will? In other words, the more we study, the more we investigate things, especially from the outside, how can we understand ourselves? Is there a problem of priority? First question. Zhu Xi always insists that you have to know before you can act. If you do not have the proper knowledge, you're not going to act properly. In terms of a moral project, is that always the way? And Zhu Xi believes that if your heart is tranquil, your heart and mind is tranquil, then the principles will be self-illuminated. So the principles are in the heart, but also feelings. But the feelings are not principles from Zhu Xi's point of view. So it is a contestation. It's always a fight between our human desires and the heavenly principle inherent in us. Both are in our heart. In our heart and mind is both our nature, which is our heavenly given principle, but also our feelings. The feelings and the emotions always overwhelm the coherence of the principle. Is this separation of the heart and mind on the one hand and principle workable? And finally, is it possible for us to imagine a kind of autonomous morality? That is the morality that is guaranteed. If I want humanity, I can get it. This is what Confucius said. And Mencius and others also considered the sensitivity or sympathy or empathy of the heart and mind itself is our principle. It's the principle that why we are human. But Zhu Xi is a little bit unsure about that. I think Zhu Xi is pessimistic because he feels that the human heart and mind is very precarious. If we do not have some kind of discipline, so in this sense, Zhu Xi comes a little bit closer to Xunzi than to Mencius. If we do not have the proper discipline, if we do not have the ritual, we do not have the ways of controlling our emotions, and no matter how our nature is endowed with the heavenly principle, we'll not be able to get in touch with it. We need always to see to it that the purity of the heart and mind be preserved so the principle can reveal themselves or reveal itself. Now, Thursday, I will try to develop an idea of the so-called embodiment, which is implicitly also a critique of Zhu Xi's position.